Hello and welcome back to my review of the Perfect Grade Gundam Astray Red Frame. In the last part, we took a look at the individual parts as well as the inner frame and the weapons. In this part, we'll be finally putting the kit all together and checking it out. So putting the Gundam together is about as simple as you'd expect. So here's the Perfect Grade Red Frame all put together, and I have to say my first thoughts is that this guy is absolutely massive and beefy. He looks like he's been hitting the gym and the protein powder super hard. I think this is partially because the Gundam is just the strike inner frame, but with some Astray parts slapped on top of it, so it doesn't fully make use of the inner frame. I think that another part is that the Perfect Grade might be trying to emulate the older concept parts, where the Astray is a bit beefier than the slender design of the Master Grade and the Real Grade. But the Perfect Grade is definitely even more beefy than the concept art, and definitely stands out a bit. Though if you're a fan of it, this definitely looks very good and detailed, worthy of the Perfect Grade name. So in terms of head articulation, it's about what you'd expect from a more modern Perfect Grade. The neck has a bit of movement back and forth that allows it to kind of chicken neck ever so slightly, and then there's a standard ball joint that attaches the entire head. Though these fins on the chest does prevent it from having too much mobility in terms of rotating off to the sides. So in terms of torso articulation, you're not going to be able to get too much of a rotation here, it just bumps into the front crotch piece, but it should be respectable enough for most poses. Now the side-to-side movement is also pretty limited, though you are going to be able to get a bit, and the ab crunch before is basically non-existent. Most you're going to be able to do is slightly rock it in its ball joint. In terms of shoulder articulation, you're going to be able to raise the shoulder armor just a tiny bit. For the entire shoulder, you can pull it up a bit, but that's about the extent you're going to get. In terms of pulling it out to reach forward, it's not going to be too impressive, though you do get a pretty decent reach across the chest. You're going to be able to get a solid 360 rotation here, as well as here. So with the arm movement, you're going to be able to get a nice bit of articulation here, and then, as mentioned before, a nice 180 rotation. Lots of nice sliding armor pieces. So for the full kick forward, unfortunately, even if you move all of these side skirts and front skirts all the way up, the massive thigh armor is still going to be bumping into the insides of the waist. So in that sense, you're not going to be able to get a very solid kick. But the bend, as seen before, is a very solid bend. You expect that from a Perfect Grade. Looks very nice. The kickback fares a bit better. You're able to slide the back skirt up, but that also bumps into the actual torso itself. And with that, you can basically get a 180-degree kickback. Attaching the katana is pretty simple. You'll just open up the side skirt and plug it in, like so. The shield requires two attachments, one on the back of the arm when you slide this armor up, as well as getting the hand into the actual handle. It can definitely be a bit finicky, mainly as this flap doesn't close up all the way like it does on the Perfect Grade strikes, but here is the overall effect you're going to get. It's a pretty solid connection. The beam rifle is a bit tricky. You gotta get the thumb onto the trigger and then the peg all plugged in, but once you do, it's a pretty solid connection as well. And the beam sabers attached onto the back, no problem at all. So with all of his weapons attached, the red frame doesn't really change that much. The biggest draw is definitely still the Gerber Astray. It's definitely very eye-catching with its chrome and sheer size. It's going to have no problem pulling off the looking down the beam rifle pose, though I do have to say, it is kind of weird seeing the red frame in such a typical Gundam pose. So unfortunately, the Perfect Grade shoulder movement isn't that great. It's not going to be able to move its hand across the chest and place its hand on the sword for a drawing pose. You can play around with the side skirt so you can angle the entire Gerber Astray a bit better, but unless you take the sword in the sheath out of its contraption and have the hand hold it, this is probably the best you're going to get. You can kind of make up for the lack of shoulder movement by dynamically posing the legs and looking at it from a very specific angle. It still looks pretty alright. So this pose really gives you an idea of just how massive the Gerber Astray actually is. The sheath does have the hole so you can peg it into the palm, but you aren't going to be able to wrap the fingers around the sheath because the sheath itself is just so massive. you're going to be able to kind of just ply its fingers around just the edge, so it gives the illusion that it's actually holding it. And with its hands holding the sheath, it's going to be able to better angle the entire grip brush straight, so it can have its hand resting on the handle for that typical samurai pose. And here's the same pose, but with some slightly more dynamic looking legs. And now that he's drawn his sword, the real fun can begin. As you'd expect from a Gundam with a samurai sword, the posing possibilities are basically limitless. Don't talk to me or my son ever again. While he may have some trouble getting off some super dynamic poses due to the bulky armor kind of limiting the articulation, it's hard to deny that he doesn't look good in basically any pose where he has his sword out. You'll get pretty good mileage out of him seeing how he can basically mimic any anime swordsman pose. Okay, maybe not every anime swordsman. Here he is next to the perfect grade Strike. Being that they share basically the same inner frame, their heights are going to be just about identical. And here he is next to the perfect grade Unicorn. This is the final battle version, and even with some books to match the Unicorn stand, the Unicorn is still going to be a solid head taller than him. So now for some of my final thoughts, as well as pros and cons on the PG red frame. So to start off with the pros, the kit has lots of nice detail. It definitely feels like a perfect grade when you're building it. It also has lots of nice sliding armors. I think that the legs really show off what the perfect grade has to offer. The Gerbera Straight in particular is very nicely detailed. This is definitely the best Gerbera Straight of any grade. You can definitely tell they put a lot of effort into it, especially with the coating of the blade. They put the pattern into it that you see on real life katanas. I think that looks very cool and very impressive. Another big pro for me is that this kit has lots of fun posing options. Given that it is a Gundam with a samurai sword, basically mimic any cool samurai pose you've ever seen. I think something that really sets this apart from the other red frame grades is the posable fingers. Samurai movies, they, flex their fingers all dynamically, and here, since the fingers are all individually posable, it can really capture that essence. Another pro is that it's a really fun and solid build. Again, I did buy this pre-built, but I did take it all apart and rebuilt it again, just to kind of get the experience, as well as clean up the nub marks. And I have to say, the build is just as good as the other perfect grades. And to lead into that, it does have a great inner frame. This inner frame is very solid, it's very impressive to look at, and I had a lot of fun building it and posing it. So that leads nicely into the cons, and one of the biggest ones for me is that this is basically the same inner frame as the perfect grade Strikes. With something like the 00 Riser and the 007 Sword / G, I can understand, it's the exact same kit but with different accessories, reuse that all you want. But here, the red frame and the Strike are completely different suits, so it feels kind of cheap and lazy for Bandai to basically slap an Astray skin on top of a Strike skeleton. And similar in that, the bulky new armor of the Astray can't really make use of the Strike's inner frame's great articulation. That's kind of a given with any kit. The frame will be more articulate than the armored kit, but whereas with the perfect grade Strike, it mainly maintains the great articulation. Here, the bulky armor definitely gets in the way with the knee bend, and maybe more importantly for me, the actual being able to swing the legs in and out, kicking it forward. The thigh armor is very bulky and just bumps into the waist armor, so that is kind of disappointing, and the over articulation does suffer from having to reuse the Strike center frame. And going on to that, this isn't quite a deal breaker for me by any means, but there is no open hatch gimmick. I think the open hatch gimmick is something that the PG line does very well, and it's one of its unique features, being able to open up all these hatches and see that crazily detailed inner frame. Here it doesn't have that, I think partially because it is reusing the Strike's inner frame, and whereas that kit did have an open hatch gimmick, it's pretty difficult to reuse that for a completely different set of outer armor. So now to my final thoughts. I initially held off getting a perfect grade red frame, despite really liking the red frame design because of the bulkiness. I much prefer the slimmer proportions featured on the master grade, real grade, and the middle build. But when I saw one being sold off for cheap, I figured why not? And having seen it in person and stripped it down and rebuilt it, my impressions have definitely improved a bit. I still don't like the bulky and stocky look, especially on the legs, but this is definitely the prettiest Gerbera Straight of any grade. While I am so disappointed by the lack of the open hatch gimmick and the recycled Strike frame, it was kind of neat seeing how they repurposed parts of the frame for the red frame armor. So overall, I think this is a pretty solid perfect grade kit. If you're looking for a first PG, I'd still recommend the Strike since I think that kit really shows off what the perfect grade line has to offer. But if you're a big Red Frame fan or just want this kit, it's still a pretty good kit, and I say go for it. So this has been my review of the perfect grade 1/60th scale Gundam Astray Red Frame. Please comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.